And we continue at 1:05 in the afternoon. Talk Radio 790 KABC, the John Phillips Show, broadcasting live from the Morongo Casino Resort and Spa Living Room Studios. Mr. Randy Wang has the week off. He'll be back with us on Monday. I've been keeping up with all of his food exploits as he makes his way around the state of New Mexico. Looks like he's enjoying himself. 800-222-KABC is the telephone number, 1-800-222-5222. It's a pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. She is the editor-at-large for Red State and author of the book, Drawing Lines, Why Conservatives Must Begin to Battle Fiercely in the Arena of Ideas, available online at Amazon.com. You can follow her on Twitter at Real Kira Davis. Kira Davis, welcome.
Hey, John, I keep forgetting to tell everybody there that I'm no longer with Red State. We had an amicable parting, so I am now a freelancer. I am free to pay my own taxes and deal with the government all on my own now as a writer.
All right.
Isn't that exciting?
Well, definitely go out and buy the book, as I know a lot of people are traveling this summer, and staring at the back of someone's head on an airplane isn't that entertaining.
Not these days, especially when you're like 2 inches from the back of somebody's head because the seats keep getting smaller and smaller.
All right. I'm going to bring up a topic, and I want you to please tell me it ain't so.
Okay.
On MSNBC earlier today, on Jose Diaz-Balart Reports, it's one of their midday shows, they had a medical expert on the show, which was former Obama official and current MSNBC medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel. And they were talking about the number of COVID-positive cases going up in the country. Here is what she had to say. Quote, "So what I think people need to know is that I would just keep people on alert, that when you're in these crowded spaces, think about the cost of colds, and sometimes many people don't have any symptoms. A mask can be your best friend. Keep it. Back in time, we had them in our pockets, in our coats, and our backpacks. Time to bring them out again, especially as the school season starts. We don't want to see kids missing school for things we could have prevented," end quote. She wants us
Like
to
what?
be wearing the masks again.
Well, things we could have prevented, like what? What are we preventing with the masks? I thought we just have gone through all this. What in the hell are we preventing with the masks? Nothing. Our kids were, I mean, you know, John, I was on your show talking about it through COVID. Our kids were in masks the longest in this country. And my daughter went to public school, was forced to put a mask on every day, and they still had a rash of COVID positive tests. I mean, at 1 month, almost the whole school was out because if you tested positive, whether you were sick or not, you know, they made you stay home. So it's just ridiculous. Two things are happening here. There's one group of people, like I was just observing yesterday, John. I was out walking around here in Orange County where I live, and you still see people with masks here and there. They're not wearing them correctly. You know, like we were all scolded. I almost got slapped in the face at the post office one day because my mask was underneath my nose back in the day. So, but we were all told you're supposed to wear them properly or they don't work, and people have them down around their nose or even just on their chin. And I'm like, this is a blankie at this point. This is just a security thing. It's not doing anything. In fact, you're probably making it more dangerous health-wise for yourself with the way you're wearing it. So that's one camp that we're seeing, the camp that like can't let go of COVID because it became some kind of like pacifier for them. Then you have the other crowd like this doctor, and I truly believe that these people are getting paid to make sure that we don't forget about COVID. Today I read that Pfizer has lost 54% or is down 54% in their profit margin this year as opposed to during COVID, which the reasons should be obvious. We realize the vaccine is dumb and we don't need it. But there's a lot of people who still have money and the future invested in keeping us scared, keeping us feeling like we're going to be unhealthy at any second, and keeping us frightened of COVID, whatever, you know, the sixth iteration of COVID, because they've got money invested. They're the ones that produce the masks. They're the ones giving the vaccines. or they just like the power. I think the doctor's in that latter stage. I think she's one of those people that's getting paid. Also, John, you know what the LA City Council has been doing and across California. How are they going to keep, their boots on our necks if we're all running around not scared of COVID anymore?
Well, I think you raise a great point. The ego aspect of this and the relevance aspect of this is a huge part of it. I remember after that Malaysia Airlines plane went missing, CNN went on a hiring spree and they hired every aviation analyst under the sun to be in-house, and they went wall to wall with it for a very long time. And they locked those people in to 1 and 2 year contracts because we had a couple of different planes that went down right around the same time. And the whole world was talking about aviation stories, and they wanted to make sure to have a stable of experts working at the networks that they could call on at a moment's notice if they needed to. But once those stories started to go away, the relevance of all of those aviation analysts went with it. And all of those people, maybe they have 1 or 2 that are still on staff, but virtually all of them that got hired when that plane first went missing are without a contract and not on television anymore. The same thing happened with COVID. When COVID hit, suddenly all of these channels needed medical experts in-house because it was a one-topic country for a long period of time. And now that COVID has gone away, a lot of these people who like having a perch on cable news, they liked having a contract with the television network, they liked all of the celebrity that came along with that, they're now losing their relevance. And the same thing is true not just for the television personalities, but for the public health officials. When Barbara Ferrer would have a press conference, everyone would cover it. When Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci and the rest of them would have a press conference, the networks would stop playing the soap operas during the day, and they would take those press conferences live, and they became household names. They became internationally recognized celebrities. Well, if suddenly we stop giving you daily updates on COVID and COVID is no longer a thing, then no one pays attention to them unless they find a way to act out and find their relevancy again. And I think that's what they're trying to do with this.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is probably a symptom of the 24-hour news cycle that we've talked about forever and ever now. But you're absolutely right. There are people who have stake. And I think you could even boil this down to personally. Because don't you see on Twitter still, X, where people are still, giving posts about, putting out posts about how I wear my mask. Why aren't you wearing my mask? I've been staying inside for the last 4 years. Why aren't you? I'm the only one who cares. I think you could even boil this down to a personal issue. There just are a lot of people who have so much invested in this virus and in the sense of control, the sense of power, even the financial rewards that it brought. For a lot of people, it's just too hard to let go. I went to see Barbie movie last week. It did really well, and then Oppenheimer has also been doing extremely well. The movies are back. I remember when we first hit COVID and they closed the movie theaters, and the liberal press, they were salivating. They were like, this is our new normal. We're never going back. You're never going to the movies again. You need to get used to the new normal. And of course that wasn't true. This was always going to be a temporary stop, but they wanted things to be worse for some reason. And of course, what happened? Well, people like going to the movies, and when you give them a good movie, they go to it. So we're back, but there's still a group of people who are like, this doctor, well, you're killing each other if you're sitting in the movies next to each other. How dare you? It's like there's just a group of people who are totally invested in us never having normal lives again.
And there's also just an element of society who are germaphobes, who have taken COVID to some insane degree, and now they believe, even though they acknowledge that COVID is no longer what it was, that we should still be wearing the mask because cold and flu season is around the corner. And if you're not wearing the mask, then you could be spreading the common cold, you could be spreading the flu, and you're a bad person for doing that.
So this is one of the things I talk to my 16-year-old daughter about all the time, and I tell her why I'm so opposed to the masks. Because not only are they useless, but it's also a symbol of what they have tried to do with us in COVID, and what they are doing, they being the government and the powers that be, what they're doing to us right now, which is they're making us afraid of each other. The goal is to make us each other's enemies, isn't it? We see that in how divisive the media is, right? We're having discussions even this week that are very divisive about pop culture and politics, and the idea is to divide us. There are stories you cover on KBC. We cover these things all the time. There are stories of the state of California coming in and removing kids from their parents' homes because those parents won't address them as the pronoun they want. The goal or the whole parental rights movement, which is based on the idea that schools want to hide your kids' identities and issues from you. The overall goal of the progressive left is to make us afraid of each other, to make us not want to be together. The whole thing of COVID that was so nefarious, besides the big power play, was the idea that now we're supposed to look at each other as a threat. And not only that, you're to blame if you get sick, as if somehow you were responsible for getting a cold or whatever. You know, you're responsible for everybody else's health. What a dangerous proposition. And you know what that does, John? And we're seeing the results of it. It drives people crazy, because who can live with the burden of having to save the world by yourself every single day?
Yeah, you're going to end up going to a meeting.
That's right. Masks Anonymous.
You know, I honestly don't care. If you want to wear a mask, go ahead, knock yourself out, wear a mask. If you want to wear gloves, go ahead, knock yourself out, wear gloves. If you want to wear a gas mask, I may look at you weird, but go ahead and wear a gas mask. Whatever floats your boat, go ahead and do it. But don't give me the business out in public because I'm not doing what you want. And certainly don't use the government to impose mandates on the population at large or punish us if we take a different position. The person that comes to mind at the absolute top of my list is Barbara Ferrer. Barbara Ferrer at the LA County Department of Public Health, the fake doctor, wanted to put the mask mandate back on the books in LA County long after it went away virtually everywhere else, and we beat her. We beat her with facts. We beat her with science. We were louder than her. And eventually the right thing happened even in Los Angeles County. Given the fact that she obviously didn't like losing that battle, but wants to maintain her relevance, could you see a scenario where Barbara Ferrer tries to bring the masks back to LA County?
Oh, I absolutely believe she's going to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying. You only have to look to what we're talking about today, which is what's happening on the news programs. We've moved on. The whole world has moved on from COVID. And yet what do you see on MSNBC in the middle of the day, prime watching hours? A doctor on there telling them we've got to get back to COVID regulations. So, of course, Ferrer is going to try. Of course she is. This is the most power, the most attention, the most influence she's ever had in her life. Why do people like that go into government? Because they're sad, pathetic little human beings who don't have power and control in their real lives. And so they take whatever semblance of it they can find in public life. That's who Barbara Ferrer is. She's an addict. She's addicted to power. And LA, you have to do a lot of compromising and kiss a lot of behind to get to the upper echelons of Los Angeles government. And so you're certainly not going to give up the power that you have when you get there very easily. I absolutely believe she will try to bring it back. And I do also believe that she'll be pushed back again. It's getting more and more unpopular, even on the left, as you know, with the LA Council. So I just think we're just going to have a lot more opportunities to point and laugh at her. If she had any shred of dignity or decency as a human being, she would just sink back into the sludge and leave us all alone.
We're speaking with Kara Davis, author of Drawing Lines, Why Conservatives Must Begin to Battle Fiercely in the Arena of Ideas, available online at Amazon.com. The big local story of late has been the heat wave that has hit not just the state of California, but other parts of the country and the world as well. And whenever they do a weather-related story, particularly when you're dealing with weather-related deaths, I know in Phoenix for whatever reason, people are dying of heat-related illnesses. Homeless people in particular who are falling asleep on the asphalt, and that will burn you, and that can cause serious damage to you, particularly if you have underlying health complications. That being said, the minute they do the story, and we've had heat stories ever since I've been alive in the state of California, they act like it's something that's brand new and we never had heat before now. They immediately transition to climate change. That climate change is the reason that suddenly it's hot in the summer, and that we need to take dramatic action. And if we don't take dramatic action, then the world is going to end in 10 years or whatever it is that Greta Thunberg is saying these days. Now, given what we saw happen during COVID, which they regarded as a crisis, and look, it was a global pandemic, so I'm not downplaying, I'm not saying the virus didn't exist. I'm not saying the virus wasn't deadly. We know that to be the case. If they regard climate change as a larger threat to the globe than COVID-19, then the actions that they took during COVID-19 would be child's play to the actions that they think they should be able to take for climate change. Do you believe we could be looking at a scenario where activists are calling for, I don't know if it's shutdowns, I don't know if it's, circumventing the separation of powers for various state governments and the federal government? Could you see them wanting to use climate change as the excuse to take all that power the way that they used COVID-19?
Why wouldn't they? We've been watching them try to wrestle power using the excuse of climate change since we even first started using the term climate change or global warming. Look, we all know that the climate is changing. Hello, dinosaurs. Everybody get it? It's not that complicated, but the idea that humans are responsible for climate change is something different. And we've been hearing that humans are responsible for it for years and years. And we know that climate change legislation is always about power, control, and money. That's why when we are being asked to sign things like the Kyoto Treaty or the Paris Accords, and typically our Republican presidents resist that because they understand we don't sign those things because that is about the Western powers, developed countries giving up their power, their energy, and doing a redistribution of wealth for third world countries. It's why they don't make people. It's why they don't make people like or countries like China and India sign on for the regulations that people or countries like Canada and the United States have to obey. It's all about redistribution of wealth, power, control. And of course, if there is somebody somewhere that can get away with locking us down for climate, they will. I do think that's a heavier lift than the pandemic stuff, especially when we've all been living and breathing and walking quite well, despite the doom and gloom news for, the last 150 years. So I think that's a harder pill to swallow, but I don't doubt somebody's going to try it.
Well, and you look back at what, say, the teachers' unions demanded during COVID-19. To be safe during COVID, they wanted to defund the police. They wanted reparations. They wanted universal health care. They wanted all the things that they wanted before COVID-19, but suddenly all of those action items became the silver bullet to keeping everyone safe during COVID-19. I would imagine that with climate change, the same would be true. Oh, you want to combat climate change? Okay, open up the borders, let everyone out of prison, raise taxes. All of the items that they wanted prior to their obsession with climate change would be the solution.
Right, of course. Once again, it's really all about power and control. It's all about robbing the decision-making from the individual and putting it in the hands of the elite. This has been going on since I was a kid. Listen, my mom is a hippie liberal. Even to this day, she's a hippie liberal. I grew up in the cult of climate change. I grew up feeling terrified to go outside of the house because I thought this might be our last day on Earth. The ozone layer might completely disintegrate and I'll burn up, or acid rain's going to come and melt my face off while I'm walking to school. That's the climate I grew up in. And that's been used as a source of control for so long. We have been talking about this for so long and yet never solved it. Why? A, it's unsolvable. B, to solve the problem would be to rescind a lot of power and control from a lot of powerful and influential people. Again, lockdowns, you can tell, you can see people salivating, you can see people like rubbing their hands together, and the activists are already talking about lockdowns. But I do believe at the end of the day, that is just too heavy of a lift for most people in the world, simply because with COVID, we didn't have enough history behind us to look at the virus and say, oh, it's not really doing what everyone said it was going to do. It was brand new. We didn't know what's going on. But I've been told, I turned 49 last week, John. I have been told since I was 5 years old that the earth has 5 years to live, 18 months to live, or 10 years to live. And I'm going to be 50 next year, and we're all still here. So we have a lot of empirical evidence that we're doing just fine without climate lockdowns.
I also think there's just something in human nature that makes us obsessed with the end of the world. Every once in a while, you'll see one of these biblical sorts of people, these people who believe in the end of the world prophecy, and they found some code in the Bible, or they found some passage in the Bible that tells them that the world is going to end on this date. And they develop these followings on the internet where people are just interested in what they have to say. And the date comes and it goes. And then they just say, oh, well, I made a miscalculation. And then they just move on to the next one. And then people pay attention to whatever date it is that they move on to. You look at these science fiction movies. You have these movies where the asteroid hits the Earth and the Earth comes to an end and it's the end of the human race. I think there's just something in our brains that makes us obsessed with this. And this is just a different form of it. It's people who regard themselves as following the science, but it's really just another end of the world cult.
I think you're right, and it's a good point to make. And I'm a Christian, and we do that in Christianity all the time. And there's always some fringe group that's like, the Lord told me the end of the world is in 2 months on this date, and then it comes and goes, and nobody cares. I do think all of this is. I saw a great clip from Russell Brand the other day, who was saying something that's very common to be said in Christian circles as well, which is that man is built to worship. We're built to worship something, to obsess over something. And if you don't worship a higher power or a God, or at least you don't recognize that, you'll worship the self. You'll worship the creation, not the creator. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people who are trying to fill the space that has all the questions in it. What is the meaning of life? What are we here for? Where do we go? They're trying to fill that space with everything but the thing that is supposed to be there. And that's really what the climate cult is, what the COVID cult is, what the trans cult is. That's all it is. It's a bunch of people looking for meaning in their lives and looking in all the wrong places, looking inward instead of looking outward.
Kira Davis, author of Drawing Lines, Why Conservatives Must Begin to Battle Fiercely in the Arena of Ideas, available online at Amazon.com. You can follow her on Twitter at Real Kira Davis. Kira Davis, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks, John. Have a great day. Stay cool out there.
You too. Right now it's time to take a look at the roads. On the John Phillips Show, Talk Radio 790 KABC, our pal Heidi Harris joins us live from Las Vegas, coming up after the news at 2, so make sure you stick around for that. 800-222-KABC is the telephone number, 1-800-222-5222. So the executive board of the California Republican Party just met in Irvine to determine how it is that they're going to divvy up the delegates in the Republican primary in 2024. Things got heated. There was yelling. There was screaming. The cops got involved. And what they ultimately ended up deciding to do was to essentially create a winner-take-all. If you got over a certain threshold and you won the primary, then you'd get all the delegates. And you say to yourself, well, California is a deep blue state. Who cares? Well, we're bigger than everyone else, and we're bigger than everyone else by a lot. So that means we have more people than any other state. And even though Democrats outnumber Republicans, there are more Republicans in the state of California than in any other state in the union. which means California will have more delegates to the Republican convention in 2024 than any other state in the union, including very Republican states, states like Texas and Florida. And what they essentially did when they made this decision was they made it so that no candidate other than Donald Trump is really going to spend much time or money campaigning here. Because the way it used to be was that each individual congressional district had, I believe it was 3 delegates, and then there were a certain number of delegates that you could win if you won statewide. California is so expensive to play in that if you were a campaign and you didn't have a lot of money, you couldn't necessarily buy ad time on this station or any of the other radio stations or the television stations without it breaking the bank, because you get exposure to so many people. But let's say you're running a shoestring campaign and you go and campaign in places where there aren't many Republicans, let's say Oakland, let's say San Francisco, let's say South Central Los Angeles. You could win in those districts if you campaign there with the 4 Republicans that live there and really clean up delegate-wise, even though it doesn't cost you a fortune to do that. So it attracted candidates to come here and campaign here. Now that it's all or nothing, you have to have tons of money to be competitive here, which means you're really only talking about one candidate, Donald Trump. So we're not going to get a whole lot of attention in the 2024 primary. Which leads me to the question, why are we voting in March then? If we're not going to be relevant in the Republican primary, we're certainly not going to be relevant in the Democratic primary, because that is, for all intents and purposes, uncontested. Joe Biden is going to be the Democratic nominee. He's going to get more votes than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Marianne Williamson. Why can't we just go back to voting in June? Why can't we do that? Even though it takes away your relevance in the presidential primary, it makes things a whole lot easier for everything else if you vote in June as opposed to March. Think about this for a second. George Gascon is going to be on the ballot in the primary in 2024. There are any number of viable candidates that are running against him who have an opportunity to beat him. When you have an incumbent that's very unpopular, you could, in theory, have a situation where they don't make it on the November ballot. They get knocked out in the primary. That almost happened to Jimmy Hahn, the former mayor of LA, when he was running for re-election. He was deeply unpopular. Villaraigosa ran against him a second time. And I forget who it was that almost made it in. Jimmy Hahn almost didn't make the November ballot. He ended up getting crushed in November, but he almost finished out of the money in the primary. When you have incumbents who are deeply unpopular, who finish out of the money in the primary, they're usually angry, they're vindictive, and they're malicious. And they try to feather their own nest as much as possible, and they try to exact revenge on all of their political enemies. And if one of their political enemies is the people, they will go for revenge against the people who voted them out. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I think it's entirely possible that George Gascon doesn't make the November ballot. There are plenty of viable candidates running in that race. People hate George Gascon. Even the people who voted for him are now beginning to realize what a complete disaster he is. Had the recall qualified for the ballot, he would have been toast, and it would not have been close. If George Gascon doesn't finish in the money in the primary, instead of having a finite period of time to create as much havoc as humanly possible, he will have almost a year. Think about this. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in March when we'll be voting. If he loses on that day, he'll have from March, the beginning of March, all the way until January to continue to be district attorney, knowing that that job expires in January. He's going to be angry. He's going to feel like the voters and the people of Los Angeles County abandoned him and his reforms. He's definitely going to want revenge on all of us. He has already shown that he's willing to abuse his power to get what he wants. And there's no one in elected office who has more power over you than the district attorney. He has the power to put you in jail, and he has the power to allow people who want to do bad things to you to roam freely. If you put a truly evil person who has scores to settle in that office, you can destroy a county. I think he's more than willing to do that. He's been more than willing to do that when he's had to face the voters yet again. If he never has to face the voters ever again, and he's got a chip on his shoulder, just imagine what we could be dealing with. We could be dealing with George Gascon on steroids. And he's not the only one. Any incumbent running for re-election is going to have their name on that March ballot, and then again, if they make it, on the November ballot. Anyone who loses in March is a potential threat. There's a reason why when you fire someone at a job, you show up with a box and you take all of their stuff and they leave that day. Because you don't want someone with an axe to grind hanging around. They could sabotage your computers. They could sabotage your office. They could steal things. They could poison your relationship with other employees. They could do all sorts of things. Even if they're not that type of person, you don't want to even give them the opportunity. Even people who leave willingly, if you go to your boss in most jobs and you tell your boss that you're leaving because you got a new opportunity in Sacramento, they won't want you to stick around more than 2 weeks. And in many cases, they don't even want you around in 2 weeks. They want to figure out who's replacing you. They want to make sure they're trained, and they want you gone ASAP. But with George Gascon, it's not going to be a guy showing up at his office with a box and taking all his stuff and leaving, and it's not going to be 2 weeks. He's going to be there for almost a year. So just think about that. Think about having a disgruntled employee who hates the world with the power that the district attorney has for almost a year. For that reason alone, we shouldn't be voting in March. We should be voting in June. There was a guy who was a congressman in the El Monte area. His name was Marty Martinez, and he had been in that office a very long time. His daughter, in fact, was a state assemblywoman in the same area. And Hilda Solis, currently a county supervisor at the time, was a hard-charging member of the California legislature. She was a state senator from El Monte. And she decided that she wanted to run for Congress, and Marty Martinez was in her way. He was old. He'd been there forever. He didn't travel back to the district often. He was one of these guys that was just very comfortable and phoning it in. And she not only beat him, she cleaned his clock in the Democratic primary. And back then, we voted in closed primaries. She cleaned his clock. He became the angriest person in the world. And this guy, who was a lifelong Democrat, who voted with the Democrats every time, switched his political parties, became a Republican, and was a vote that Newt Gingrich could count on until he finished his term. Back then, I think we voted. It was the first time we moved our primary up. It was March or maybe even February That's when he got voted out. He had a full year to vote against the Democrats every chance he got because he was so angry at what happened in that primary. By voting in March, we are giving politicians who get voted out the opportunity to do that to all of us. And the one that worries me the most is George Gascon. It's 1:55 on the John Phillips Show, Talk Radio 790 KABC. Heidi Harris joins us at the top of the hour. Many of you are emailing me at johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com. That's johnnydon'tlikeshow@gmail.com, asking where the podcast of yesterday's show is. We're a little bit short-staffed this week, but we're going to get it up as soon as we possibly can, and you'll be able to enjoy that podcast ASAP. In addition to today's show, and all the shows from last week and the week before that are already up. So if you can't get yesterday's show, enjoy something from last week, but we'll get it up as soon as we possibly can. It's 1:56. This is Talk Radio 790 KABC. We've got one more hour coming up on the John Phillips Show. Heidi Harris on loan from Sin City joins us. Don't you go anywhere. This is Talk Radio 790 KABC.